I am evidence. I am microscopic chains of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, the building blocks of identity itself. I am DNA. And for 28 years, I waited. On September 3, 1990, I became a witness to horror. I was collected from an 81-year-old woman named Katherine Criggler in a hospital in Starkville, Mississippi, a college town where maroon and white banners for Mississippi State University flutter above tree-lined streets, where the biggest concerns are usually Saturday football games and final exams, not the kind of evil that knocked on Katherine's door that Labor Day evening. I was sealed in plastic tubes and paper envelopes. Preserved. Catalogued. Filed away. And I waited in darkness while the world moved on without answers. This is not the story you've heard before. This is not told from the detective's desk or the killer's shadowed perspective. This is told from mine, from the evidence that never forgot, never degraded, never gave up. This is the story of how science caught up to memory, and how genealogy became a hunting dog sniffing backward through time. Let me take you back. September 3rd, 1990. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The internet was something most people had never heard of. And in Starkville, Mississippi, a town of approximately 18,000 souls, swelling with students from Mississippi State, two elderly women were preparing for bed. Katherine Criggler was 81 years old. She'd already lost one leg to amputation and relied on a wheelchair to move through her modest home on Old Highway 82. Her friend and caretaker, Betty Jones, 65 years old, with a kind face and patient hands, was helping her prepare for the night. Betty had driven from her own home to spend the evening, as she often did. These were friends bound by years of trust and companionship. The knock came just after dusk. Katherine, from her wheelchair in the back of the house, couldn't get to the door quickly. So Betty went. Betty opened the door to a stranger, a young man, probably in his early 20s. Blonde hair, blue eyes, cut short almost in a crew-cut style. What happened next happened fast. Before Betty could speak, before she could ask what he wanted, the man produced a knife and slashed her throat. Betty Jones died where she stood in the doorway, blood pooling beneath her as her heart pumped its last beats. The killer, still holding the knife, still covered in Betty's blood, walked through the house. Back to where Katherine sat in her wheelchair. He raped her. He strangled her. He broke her pelvis with the violence of the assault. Then he took her purse, walked back through the house past Betty's body, and locked the door behind him as he left, sealing the two women inside with their terror. But Katherine Criggler, wheelchair-bound and brutalized, did something extraordinary. She pulled herself across the floor. Inch by agonizing inch. She reached the telephone. And she called 911. That's when I was born. When paramedics arrived and transported Katherine to the hospital, when doctors performed a rape kit examination, when nurses swabbed and collected and preserved. That's when I became evidence. Katherine survived that night. She survived long enough to tell police what she'd seen. A young man, blonde, blue-eyed, early 20s, with short spiked hair. She described him with clarity despite her trauma. She gave investigators every detail she could remember. But 2 months later, Katherine Criggler died from her injuries. But it wasn't just the physical trauma. When family told her that Betty had died, that her dear friend had been murdered trying to answer that door, Katherine's spirit broke. Her granddaughter, Julia Catherine Holt, would later say that Katherine died as much from heartbreak as from her wounds. 2 murders. One completed in seconds, one taking 2 months. And a killer who vanished like smoke. Here's what you need to understand about 1990. I existed, but I was useless. DNA technology was in its infancy for criminal investigation. While scientists could extract me, analyze me, sequence me, they couldn't match me to anyone without a direct comparison. There was no CODIS database yet, no national DNA registry. And even if there had been, the killer had no prior record. He'd never been swabbed. He'd never been arrested. So I was filed away. Stored properly, thankfully, in evidence rooms where temperature and humidity were controlled. The Starkville Police Department, despite being a small-town force, followed protocol. They preserved me because they believed, or at least hoped, that someday, science would catch up to their need for answers. The original investigators interviewed hundreds of people. They followed leads that went nowhere. They developed suspects who were cleared. They watched the case grow cold, month by month, year by year. Detective David Lindley, who caught the case initially, did everything he could with 1990 technology. He collected fingerprints. He documented blood types. He took statements. But I, the most important witness, remained silent, my secrets locked in molecular bonds he couldn't yet read. The town of Starkville tried to move on, but fear lingered like fog. If this could happen to two elderly women in their home, it could happen to anyone. Parents warned their children. Doors stayed locked. The university students, usually carefree, looked over their shoulders walking home at night. And I waited. While I waited in evidence storage, life continued for those who loved Betty Jones. Jason B. Jones was 10 years old when he got the phone call. His step-grandmother, Betty, who'd married his grandfather later in life, had been murdered in Mississippi. He was living outside Houston, Texas, trying to process words like stabbed and killed, and they don't know who did it. His mother, Colleen, tried to explain, "We don't know why, but God called Betty home and you'll see her again someday." But children remember trauma differently than adults. Jason grew up with a low hum of fear, a background radiation of knowing that somewhere, the person who killed Betty was still out there. Still breathing. Still free. Maybe watching. Maybe waiting to kill again. His younger brother Simon, only 4 at the time, absorbed the family's grief without fully understanding it. Together, these boys carried Betty's memory into adulthood, her death an unresolved chapter in their family story. The years passed. 1990 became 2000. Then 2010. The case file gathered dust. But I remained, preserved in plastic and paper, my molecular structure intact, waiting for someone to remember I existed. In 2004, Sergeant Bill Lott inherited the case. Lott was Starkville born and raised. His roots ran deep in this Mississippi earth. He'd been raised by aunts and uncles after his parents divorced, and elderly relatives had played crucial roles in his life. When he read the case file, when he saw the crime scene photos, which he would later describe as haunting nightmares, he took it personally. To think that somebody would do something as heinous as this to elderly people, he said, it made me angry. Lott didn't have much to work with. He had boxes of evidence, hundreds of pages of reports, and 15 years of frustration from previous investigators. But he also had me. And he had something the original detectives didn't have, advancing technology. In 2005, Lott requested a DNA evaluation of the evidence. By then CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was operational, a national database of DNA profiles from convicted felons. Lott ran my profile through the system. No match. He ran it again. No match. He tested DNA from nearly 60 different suspects over the years. Men who'd been in the area. Men who fit the description. Men who'd committed similar crimes elsewhere. One by one, they were all cleared. None of them were my owner. None of them were the killer. Lott refused to give up. He worked the case in his spare time, on his own hours, driven by a promise he'd made to himself and to the memory of 2 elderly women who died violently. But even his determination couldn't change the fundamental problem. Without a match in the database, I was just a genetic signature with no name attached. The Mississippi State Crime Lab didn't conduct familial DNA searches, a process where investigators look for partial matches that might indicate a relative of the perpetrator. They only did exact matches, and there were none. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. By 2018, Jason B. Jones was an adult. He'd grown up carrying the weight of Betty's unsolved murder. And he decided to do something about it. With his brother Simon, Jason created a podcast called Knock Knock, named for that terrible moment when the killer arrived at Katherine Criggler's door. Over 7 episodes, they interviewed investigators, DNA experts, family members, and people who'd known Betty and Katherine. They explored the case from every angle, hoping to generate new leads. The podcast brought national attention to the case. CBS's 48 Hours picked up the story. Oxygen's True Crime Network featured it. Suddenly, the Labor Day murders of Starkville, Mississippi, cold for 28 years, were back in the public consciousness. But Jason and Simon were careful to credit where credit was due. When the breakthrough finally came, Jason was adamant, "Zero credit goes to our podcast for the apprehension of this suspect. 100% of the credit goes to the Starkville Police Department." Because the real breakthrough wasn't coming from media attention or public pressure. It was coming from me. And from a company in Virginia that had figured out how to make me talk. Let me explain what changed. Let me explain how I finally got to tell my story. In April 2018, investigators in California announced they'd caught the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who terrorized the state in the 1970s and 80s. They caught him using a revolutionary technique, forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of looking for an exact match in a criminal database, they'd uploaded the killer's DNA to GeneMatch, a public genealogy website where people voluntarily upload their genetic information to find relatives and trace family trees. The DNA didn't match anyone directly, but it matched distant relatives. And from there, genealogists worked backward, building family trees, identifying common ancestors, and narrowing down possible suspects until they had their man, Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who'd been hiding in plain sight for decades. The technique exploded across law enforcement. Suddenly, cold cases that had been considered unsolvable were being cracked at the rate of 1 per week. And at the center of this revolution was a company called Parabon Nanolabs, based in Reston, Virginia. Parabon had started in DNA phenotyping, using genetic markers to predict what an unknown person looked like. Hair color, eye color, skin tone, facial structure. They'd helped police create composite sketches from nothing but DNA. But when the Golden State Killer case broke, Parabon pivoted hard into genetic genealogy. They hired Cece Moore, a professional genealogist, to head their genetic genealogy unit. Moore and her team became DNA hunters, using science and old-fashioned genealogical research to identify suspects no one had been able to find before. Detective Bill Lott heard about this. He saw what Parabon was doing. And he thought about me, sitting in evidence storage for 28 years, waiting for exactly this moment. In 2018, Lott sent samples to Parabon Nanolabs. The scientists there extracted my information, sequenced my genome, and uploaded it to GeneMatch. They were looking for relatives of my owner, people who shared portions of my genetic code because they shared common ancestors. Within days, they had hits. Not exact matches. That would have been too easy. But they found distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people connected to my owner through family trees that branched back 100 years or more. And from there, the genealogists went to work. They built family trees. They pored through census records, marriage certificates, birth announcements, obituaries. They traced lineages forward and backward through time, looking for the confluence of genetics and geography. Who were the descendants of these common ancestors? Which of them would have been in their early 20s in 1990? Which of them would have been in or around Starkville, Mississippi on Labor Day weekend? The genealogical work was complex. These weren't simple family trees. They were tangled branches of marriages, divorces, relocations, name changes. It took expertise, patience, and a little bit of luck. But eventually, the family trees narrowed to 2 brothers. 2 men who shared ancestry with the DNA matches. 2 men who fit the age range. 2 men, one of whom had to be me. Had to be the killer. Detective Lott studied everything he could find about both brothers. Their histories. Their movements. their lives. And he zeroed in on one, Michael Wayne DeVaughn, from Rienzi, Mississippi, a small town about 70 miles northeast of Starkville. DeVaughn would have been 23 years old on Labor Day, 1990. He fit the physical description Katherine Criggler had given: blonde, blue eyes, young. But he'd never been on law enforcement's radar. He'd never been a suspect. He'd lived quietly for nearly 3 decades, a ghost who'd committed horror and simply walked away. In October 2018, Michael Wayne DeVaughn was sitting in the Tishomingo County Jail on an unrelated drug charge: possession of a controlled substance. A routine arrest that had nothing to do with murder. But Detective Lott saw an opportunity. While DeVaughn was in custody, Lott obtained a DNA swab. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for since September 3, 1990. The comparison. My genetic signature, preserved for 28 years, was matched against Michael DeVaughn's DNA. Perfect match. Exact match. No ambiguity, no doubt, no margin for error. I was his. He was the killer. On October 13, 2018, Michael Wayne DeVaughn was arrested and charged with capital murder and sexual battery in the deaths of Betty Jones and Katherine Criggler. The Labor Day murders case, cold for 28 years, was suddenly very hot. Who was Michael Wayne DeVaughn? That's the shocking part of this story. He was nobody. He'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life in northern Mississippi. He had virtually no criminal history before the drug charge that put him in jail. According to Prentiss County Sheriff Randy Toller, DeVaughn had no credit history either. He kept a low profile, worked odd jobs, and maintained such anonymity that when police in Boonville were asked about him, they barely had records. He'd been, as investigators say, out of pocket for nearly 3 decades. Not hiding, exactly. Just not noticed. Living his life while Betty Jones's family mourned, while Katherine Criggler's granddaughter grew up without her best friend, while a town lived in fear of a killer they couldn't identify. DeVaughn had no connection to the victims that anyone could find. He wasn't a relative, wasn't a friend, wasn't someone with a grudge. He was a stranger who knocked on a door one Labor Day evening and committed unthinkable violence for reasons only he knows. The randomness of it, the sheer senseless horror of it, made the crime even more terrifying. This wasn't a domestic dispute gone wrong. This wasn't a robbery where things escalated. This was a predator selecting victims, committing atrocities, and vanishing back into normalcy. In 2019, an Oktibbeha County grand jury indicted Michael Wayne DeVaughn on 1 count of capital murder and 1 count of sexual battery. If convicted at trial on the capital murder charge, he faced the death penalty. But DeVaughn's attorney knew what I knew: there was no defense. I was irrefutable. I was science. I was truth frozen in time. No amount of legal maneuvering could explain away an exact DNA match. On November 17, 2020, 30 years and 2 months after Betty Jones opened her friend's door to death, Michael Wayne DeVaughn stood before Judge Lee Coleman in Lowndes County Circuit Court and pleaded guilty to capital murder. In exchange for the plea, prosecutors dropped the sexual battery charge, and DeVaughn avoided the possibility of execution. Judge Coleman sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Julia Catherine Holt, Katherine Criggler's granddaughter, stood before the man who'd raped and murdered her grandmother. She looked him in the eyes. "I hope you feel remorse," she said. "I hope you've thought about that for 30 years. She told him that Katherine had been her best friend, that her death had left a void that could never be filled. But then she said something remarkable. "I forgive you, and I pray that you find peace in your heart." Holt explained later that she was glad DeVaughn had pleaded guilty, glad he'd avoided the death penalty, because she opposed capital punishment. Her forgiveness wasn't about excusing what he'd done. It was about refusing to let his evil poison the rest of her life. Jennifer McWhorter Taylor, Betty Jones's niece, attended the hearing as well. She spoke of the relief of finally having closure, of knowing that the person responsible would spend the rest of his life in prison. But Bill Lott, the detective who'd worked the case for 14.5 years, had mixed feelings. "You never want to see someone go to prison for the rest of their life," he said. "So it's a mixed feeling. Whatever happens to Michael DeVaughn doesn't bring Betty back. And so I return to where I began. I am evidence. I am DNA. For 28 years, I was the only witness who never forgot, who never died, who never gave up. I waited in darkness while the world invented the technology to hear my testimony. And when that technology arrived, I told the truth with absolute clarity." Michael Wayne DeVaughn, now 53 years old, sits in a Mississippi prison where he will remain until death. His DNA, identical to mine, convicted him of crimes he thought he'd gotten away with. This case represents a turning point in criminal justice. It demonstrates that time is no longer an ally to killers. That you can't simply wait out the statute of limitations on murder. There is no statute of limitations on murder, or hope that memories fade and evidence deteriorates. Because I don't fade. I don't deteriorate if properly preserved. And I don't forget. Across America, cold cases are being reopened. Evidence collected in the 1970s, 80s, 90s is being re-examined using forensic genetic genealogy. Killers who thought they were safe, who thought the passage of decades had protected them, are being identified and arrested. The Golden State Killer. The Kristen Smart case. The Jody Huizentraut case. Dozens, then hundreds of cases cracked open by the same technique that caught Michael DeVaughn. There are ethical questions, of course. Privacy concerns about using public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes. Debates about familial searching and whether catching criminals justifies examining the DNA of their innocent relatives. These are important conversations society needs to have. But I am evidence. And evidence doesn't have an agenda. Evidence simply is. Jason and Simon Jones, who created the Knock Knock podcast to keep their step-grandmother's memory alive, got the closure they'd sought their entire lives. Betty Jones's murder was solved. Katherine Criggler's death was avenged. Detective Bill Lott, who refused to let the case die, finally got to keep the promise he'd made to himself. He was able to call Julia Catherine Holt and Jennifer McWhorter Taylor and tell them, "We got him." Holt later said, "When I got the call from Sergeant Lott, it was disbelief. It was shock. You wait so long to hear those words." The town of Starkville could finally release the fear it had carried for 3 decades. The monster who'd knocked on Katherine Criggler's door on Labor Day 1990 was no longer an unknown shadow. He had a name. He had a face. And he was behind bars forever. As of 2025, Parabon Nanolabs has helped solve hundreds of cold cases using forensic genetic genealogy. Cece Moore and her team continue their work, building family trees from genetic breadcrumbs, turning DNA into names and names into arrests. Other companies and independent genealogists have joined the field. Law enforcement agencies are training officers in the technique. District attorneys are learning how to prosecute cases built on genealogical evidence. The science continues to advance. DNA sequencing becomes faster and cheaper. Databases grow larger. Techniques become more sophisticated. And in evidence rooms across the country, in boxes and tubes and paper envelopes, millions of DNA samples wait. They wait for their chance to speak, to identify, to bring closure to families who've waited decades for answers. Some of those samples are from open cases, unsolved murders that haunt detectives and devastate families. Some are from crimes that happened before DNA technology existed, crimes where the evidence was collected but never properly analyzed. Each one is a witness, silent but patient. Each one carries the identity of a perpetrator in its molecular structure. Each one waits for science to advance just a little bit further, for genealogists to build one more family tree, for detectives to never give up. I want you to think about something as we close this story. On September 3, 1990, there was a knock on Katherine Criggler's door. Betty Jones answered it. And in the space of minutes, 2 lives were destroyed and a town was traumatized. For 28 years, that knock echoed unanswered. The question of who was at the door remained a mystery that seemed unsolvable. But then, in October 2018, there was another knock. This one was at Michael Wayne DeVaugh's cell door. This one was Detective Bill Lott saying, "We know what you did. We have your DNA. We have proof." Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, justice is just waiting for the right tool to arrive. I was that tool. A microscopic witness, preserved and patient. And when called upon to testify, I told the truth with absolute certainty. Betty Jones and Katherine Criggler are gone. But they are not forgotten. Their story is told through me, through the genetic evidence that never stopped being evidence, that never stopped being relevant, that never stopped waiting for the chance to speak. And I did speak. Finally, after 28 years of silence, I spoke. And Michael Wayne DeVaughn will spend the rest of his life in prison because I told the truth about that knock on the door. For those interested in understanding exactly how forensic genetic genealogy works, here's a brief explanation. Traditional DNA forensics relies on CODIS, a database containing DNA profiles from convicted felons and arrestees. When crime scene DNA is uploaded to CODIS, the system looks for exact matches. If the perpetrator has never been arrested or convicted, there's no match. Forensic genetic genealogy works differently. Instead of looking for exact matches, investigators upload DNA to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. These databases contain genetic information from millions of people who voluntarily submitted DNA to trace their ancestry. The uploaded crime scene DNA doesn't need to match anyone exactly. Instead, it looks for partial matches, people who share significant amounts of DNA with the perpetrator because they're relatives. Third cousins might share 1.5% of their DNA. Second cousins might share 3%. Once these partial matches are identified, professional genealogists build family trees. They use traditional genealogical research, census records, obituaries, marriage certificates, birth records, to map out how these relatives are connected. They look for common ancestors and then trace the family lines forward to the present day. This process can identify a pool of potential suspects, people who are the right age, who lived in the right location, who descended from the identified common ancestors. Investigators then collect DNA samples from these individuals, either through voluntary submission, discarded items, or court-ordered swabs, and compare them directly to the crime scene DNA. When there's an exact match, as there was with Michael DeVaughn, the case is solved. The technique has proven remarkably effective. According to reports from May 2019, Parabon Nanolabs was solving cold cases at a rate of approximately 1 per week. As of November 2020, they'd helped solve nearly 100 cases. The method has limitations and raises important questions about privacy. When you upload your DNA to a genealogy website to learn about your ancestry, should that information be accessible to law enforcement? If police use your DNA to identify a relative who committed a crime, does that violate your privacy even though you've done nothing wrong? These questions don't have easy answers. But what's undeniable is this: forensic genetic genealogy is revolutionizing cold case investigation. It's giving investigators a tool they've never had before, the ability to identify criminals who've been unknown for decades. And it's giving closure to families like Betty Jones's and Katherine Criggler's, who waited nearly 3 decades for the truth.